Patrick's fist collided with Jack's jaw, sending shockwaves through the bustling bar. Glasses clattered, chairs scraped, and a gasp rippled through the crowd as Jack stumbled backward, clutching his face. Emily's panicked voice cut through the chaos. "Patrick, stop!" But Patrick couldn't hear her. The sight of her leaning into Jack, her laughter like a dagger, fueled his rage. He lunged again, only to be restrained by bouncers, pulling him away as the room swirled with whispers and judgmental stares. Emily stood frozen, her eyes filled with shock. Not concern, not regret, just disappointment. The weight of betrayal crashed down on Patrick, leaving him to wonder if this moment marked the end of everything he thought he knew. But before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the little breakfast nook Patrick had built with his own hands. Emily sat across from him, sipping her coffee, her laughter filling the space as she recounted a funny story from work. Patrick leaned back, savoring the sound of her voice, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the soft, melodic rhythm of their life together. Their routine was simple, but it was theirs. Sunday brunches at the cafe on Main Street, where the staff knew their usual order. Date nights where they'd explore new cuisines, often laughing over Patrick's mispronunciations of foreign menu items. Quiet evenings, spent curled up on the couch, Emily's head resting on Patrick's shoulder as they watched yet another crime drama she'd chosen. Patrick couldn't imagine a life without her. She was his anchor, his best friend, and his greatest joy. "I thought we had it all," Patrick would later reflect, his voice heavy with regret. A love that was unshakable. Emily's words that morning seemed to echo his sentiment, though they now felt like a cruel irony. "You make my world brighter, Patrick," she said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Her smile was genuine, her affection palpable. But hindsight had a way of tainting even the happiest memories. Patrick would remember that morning not as a moment of bliss, but as the calm before the storm, the last time he felt truly at peace. The bar buzzed with energy that night, its dim lighting and clinking glasses providing a sharp contrast to the cozy quiet of their home. Patrick wasn't one for crowded places, but Emily had insisted they get out, break the monotony. "Come on, it'll be fun," she had said, her enthusiasm contagious. And so they found themselves sitting at a small table near the back, the noise of laughter and conversation enveloping them. Patrick watched Emily, her eyes bright as she scanned the room. She seemed lighter, more carefree than usual, and Patrick felt a flicker of contentment. Maybe this was what they needed, a break from routine, a reminder of how much they enjoyed each other's company. "I'll be right back," Patrick said, standing and gesturing toward the restroom. Emily nodded, leaning in with a playful smile. "Go ahead, I'll save your seat," she replied. Patrick smiled back, thinking nothing of it. It was a simple moment, he would later recall, his voice tinged with disbelief. A mundane evening, or so I thought. Returning from the restroom, Patrick weaved through the crowded bar, his eyes searching for Emily. He spotted her before he reached the table, and the sight stopped him cold. Emily was laughing, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man Patrick didn't recognize. The man, tall and confident, leaned in close, his arm draped casually over the back of Emily's chair. The intimacy of their posture, the way her eyes sparkled as she looked at him, it all felt wrong. Patrick approached, his stomach twisting. "You're in my seat," he said, his voice low but firm. Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Relax, Patrick," she said lightly, her tone dismissive. "Find another one." Her words hit harder than any slap could. Patrick stood frozen, his mind racing. The man Jack barely acknowledged him, his smug smile adding fuel to Patrick's growing anger. "I didn't understand it then," Patrick would later admit, but that moment, it was the beginning of everything unraveling. As he stood there, the noise of the bar seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The air around Patrick seemed to grow hotter as he stood there, fists clenched at his sides. The smug look on Jack's face was like gasoline to the fire roaring inside him. Without thinking, Patrick stepped forward, grabbing Jack by the collar. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Patrick growled, his voice low but trembling with anger. Jack barely flinched, his smirk unwavering. "We were just talking, man. Calm down." Of course. The words were infuriatingly casual, dismissive. Patrick's grip tightened as his mind flashed with the image of Emily leaning in, her hand lingering on Jack's arm. His rational thoughts were drowned out by a surge of pure rage. "Talking?" Patrick spat, his voice rising. "That's what you call this?" "Patrick, stop!" Emily's voice cut through the commotion, sharp and commanding. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin, but he didn't release Jack. Around them, heads began to turn, the lively chatter of the bar quieting as people noticed the brewing confrontation. "You're embarrassing me," Emily hissed, her eyes darting around at the growing crowd. Patrick's head snapped toward her, his face twisted with hurt and disbelief. "Embarrassing you? You've already humiliated me." His voice cracked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jack shoved Patrick's hand away, brushing himself off with a casualness that made Patrick's blood boil even more. "Take it easy, man. You're making a scene," Jack said, his tone dripping with condescension. Patrick lunged, his fist connecting with Jack's jaw in a sickening thud. The bar erupted into chaos. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped against the floor, and a few people gasped. Jack stumbled back, clutching his face, as Emily jumped between them. "Patrick, stop it," she screamed, her voice trembling with panic. "You're acting crazy." Bouncers pushed through the crowd, grabbing Patrick and pulling him away as he strained against their grip, his chest heaving. The room spun around him, a blur of faces and whispered judgments. But the clearest thing was Emily's expression. Not concern, not even anger. Just disappointment. Minutes later, they stood outside the bar in the cool night air, the muffled sounds of music and chatter spilling out behind them. Patrick's fists were still clenched, his knuckles raw and red. Emily stood a few steps away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What the hell was that, Patrick?" she demanded, her voice low but laced with fury. "What was that?" Patrick shot back, his voice incredulous. "You tell me, sitting there with him like that, laughing, touching him, it's disgusting." Emily rolled her eyes, shaking her head in exasperation. "You're acting crazy. Jack's just a friend. Do you hear yourself?" Patrick took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Friend? Since when did friends hold each other so intimately?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening. "You don't trust me, do you?" she asked, her voice softer now but no less accusatory. "Is that what this is about?" Patrick let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Don't turn this on me. I trusted you, Emily. I trusted you with everything. But what I saw in there..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "That's not nothing." Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she muttered, avoiding his eyes. "Jack's just easy to talk to. You've been so distant lately, Patrick." Her words stung, but they also planted a seed of doubt. Had he been distant? Was he overreacting? Patrick's anger faltered, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. But as he looked at Emily, the image of her with Jack still burned in his mind, refusing to fade. The silence between them was heavy, the night air growing colder. "I need some time to think," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, leaving Patrick standing alone, his heart pounding in his chest. Patrick stormed down the street, the cold night air biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His fists were still clenched, his breath coming in ragged bursts as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. Around him, the city seemed alive. Cars honking, laughter spilling from nearby bars, but it all felt distant, as though he were watching it from behind a thick pane of glass. The anger that had driven him out of the bar began to fade, replaced by a searing ache in his chest. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, trying to steady himself, but the image of Emily with Jack was seared into his mind, her hand on Jack's arm, her head tilted back in laughter. It played on a cruel loop, mocking him with every step he took. Her laughter. It had always been his favorite sound, a bright melody that filled their home and lifted his spirits no matter how bad his day had been. But tonight, it wasn't comforting. Tonight, it rang in his ears, sharp and haunting, each note a reminder of her betrayal. The bitterness of the air mirrored the storm inside him. His thoughts swirled, chaotic and relentless, refusing to settle. Was it his fault? Had he been blind, too trusting? Or was it something deeper, a crack in their foundation that he'd never noticed until now? It was Cassidy. He stopped abruptly, leaning against a lamppost as the weight of it all threatened to crush him. "How did we get here?" he whispered to himself, his breath visible in the freezing air. He replayed the night over and over in his mind, searching for signs he might have missed. Maybe she'd been pulling away for longer than he realized. Maybe he'd been too caught up in work, too focused on the mundane routines of their life to notice. But even as he tried to rationalize it, the anger flared again. She hadn't just pulled away. She had chosen to humiliate him, to share a moment with someone else that should have been his. The hurt was raw, jagged, cutting into him every time he breathed. The streets grew quieter as Patrick wandered aimlessly, the noise of the bar fading into the background. He felt untethered, as though the ground beneath him had shifted and left him grasping for something to hold on to. He thought of their mornings together, the quiet intimacy of their shared routines. He thought of her smile, her touch, the way she used to look at him as if he were the center of her world. But tonight, that world felt foreign. He no longer knew where he stood in it, or if he belonged in it at all. Patrick glanced up at the dark sky, his jaw tightening as tears threatened to spill. "How could she do this?" he muttered, his voice breaking. The night offered no answers, only the cold wind and the endless ache in his chest. As he stood there, his breath hitching in the silence, one thought rose above the rest, clear and unrelenting. Something had changed between them, and he wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. The front door slammed behind Patrick as he stepped into the house, the sound echoing through the silent rooms. Emily followed moments later, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She didn't speak right away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Patrick paced the living room like a caged animal, his emotions too raw to contain. Finally, he turned to face her, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "How could you? In front of everyone?" Emily sighed, rolling her eyes as if he were a petulant child. "It was harmless, Patrick," she said, her tone clipped. "You're the one making it a problem." Her nonchalance was like a slap to his face. Patrick's fists clenched at his sides, his voice rising. "Don't gaslight me, Emily. I'm not blind. I saw the way you looked at him, the way you touched him." Emily's posture stiffened, and her expression darkened. "Touched him," she repeated, incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? You're acting paranoid." "That's because you've given me every reason to be," Patrick shot back, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration. "You laughed at his jokes, leaned into him like I wasn't even there, and then you told me to relax? Who does that, Emily? Who treats their husband like that?" Emily threw her hands up, exasperated. "I can't believe this. You're blowing everything out of proportion. Jack is just a friend. That's all he's ever been." Patrick took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "A friend? Friends don't hold each other like that. Friends don't make you forget your husband is sitting right there, watching." Emily's face flushed, whether from anger or guilt, Patrick couldn't tell. "You're impossible," she snapped. "You can't handle the idea of me having a life outside of you." Her words stung, but Patrick refused to back down. "This isn't about you having a life, Emily. It's about respect. It's about trust. And tonight, you shattered both." She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "Trust? You're the one who just lost control in public. You made a fool of yourself, and me, and now you're trying to make me the villain?" Patrick's jaw tightened, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You humiliated me first," he said through gritted teeth. "You made me feel like I didn't matter, like I was invisible." For a moment, Emily faltered, her gaze softening. But just as quickly she hardened again, her voice laced with defiance. "You're being ridiculous, Patrick. You always jump to the worst conclusions." Patrick threw up his hands, his frustration spilling over. "Because you give me nothing else to work with. You keep secrets, you hide behind excuses, and then you act like I'm the crazy one for noticing." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Emily crossed her arms again, her jaw tight, while Patrick stood with his hands on his hips, staring at her as if searching for the woman he thought he knew. "You know what, Patrick?" Emily finally said, her voice cold. "Maybe if you trusted me more, we wouldn't be here right now." Patrick let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Trust you? After tonight? Emily, trust doesn't survive lies. And right now, I can't tell what's true anymore." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the bedroom without another word. The sound of her retreating footsteps echoed through the quiet house, leaving Patrick standing alone in the living room, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The argument had solved nothing, and yet it had revealed everything: the cracks in their relationship, the distance between them, and the betrayal he could no longer ignore. The days following their argument were a blur of unease and growing suspicion. Patrick tried to dismiss his doubts, but the changes in Emily's behavior were impossible to ignore. She no longer laughed as easily, her eyes darting away when he asked simple questions. Conversations that once flowed freely now felt forced, punctuated by awkward silences. Her phone seemed to be a constant presence. It buzzed at all hours, and she would glance at it quickly before turning the screen away from him. When he asked who was texting, her answers were vague and dismissive. "It's just work stuff," she'd say, or "you wouldn't care. It's nothing important." But to Patrick, it didn't feel like nothing. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Emily's phone buzzed again. She grabbed it with a speed that startled him, her thumb swiping across the screen before he could see anything. A nervous smile played on her lips as she stood up. "I need to take this," she murmured, leaving the room without waiting for his response. Patrick watched her retreating figure, his chest tightening. Her phone buzzed constantly, he reflected bitterly, and she always seemed one step ahead, ready with excuses. It wasn't just the phone. Emily started working late more often, her explanations always tinged with a forced casualness. "The project's just taking longer than expected," she'd say, or "Jack's team needs some extra help. No big deal." Patrick noticed how her tone became defensive when he pressed for details, how her smile no longer reached her eyes. The distance between them grew with each passing day. She no longer reached for his hand during quiet moments or kissed him goodnight before bed. When they shared a meal, her gaze seemed fixed on a point far away, her mind unreachable. Patrick tried to shake off the paranoia, telling himself he was overreacting, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The woman he loved was slipping away, and he couldn't understand why. One sleepless night, as Patrick lay alone in bed, the weight of his suspicions pressed heavily on his chest. Emily was asleep in the guest room, having claimed she needed space to think. Patrick stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He needed answers, something tangible to either confirm or dispel the doubts that consumed him. His eyes flicked to the small desk in the corner of the room where Emily's laptop sat closed. She always kept her phone locked, but Patrick remembered she had once backed up her messages to her laptop for storage. The thought tugged at him, filling him with both dread and determination. "I hesitated," he would later admit, but the need for answers outweighed the guilt. Moving as quietly as he could, Patrick slipped out of bed and made his way to the desk. His hands trembled as he opened the laptop, the soft glow of the screen lighting up the dark room. The password was simple, her mother's maiden name. She'd told him years ago, trusting him completely. The irony wasn't lost on him. Navigating to the backup folder, Patrick felt his heartbeat quicken. The folder was there, labeled simply phone_backup. His stomach churned as he clicked it open, the progress bar crawling across the screen. What would he find? Did he even want to know? The folder opened, revealing a list of files, texts, call logs, photos. His eyes locked on the folder marked Messages. With a deep breath, Patrick clicked. The texts began to load, each message a fragment of a conversation, a glimpse into Emily's private world. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scrolled, his fears inching closer to reality with every word he read. And then he saw it. A message from Jack, time-stamped just a few days ago. "You make my days brighter, Emily. Can't wait to see you again." Patrick froze, his stomach sinking. The truth he had feared was now staring back at him, undeniable and devastating. Patrick's eyes scanned the screen, each word feeling like a punch to the gut. At first, the messages seemed harmless, ordinary exchanges between colleagues, discussions about work projects, shared jokes about office mishaps. It was all so casual, so normal. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had overreacted, if he had let his imagination get the better of him. But as he scrolled further, the tone began to shift. The messages grew longer, more personal. Jack's words became laced with compliments, subtle at first but growing bolder with time. And Emily? She didn't just respond. She encouraged him, her replies warm and open in a way that made Patrick's chest tighten. "Jack, you were incredible in that meeting today. The way you handled those questions, just wow. You're amazing, Em." "Emily, thanks, Jack. I don't know about amazing, though. You're too kind." And Patrick stared at the screen, the light from the laptop casting a pale glow on his face. His jaw tightened as he continued reading. The familiarity in their tone was unmistakable, the kind of ease that came with a connection deeper than casual friendship. "Yeah. Kind? I'm just being honest. You deserve someone who tells you how incredible you are." "Emily, lol, careful, Jack. You're going to make me blush." His hands clenched into fists. The messages weren't explicit yet, but they didn't need to be. The words themselves carried a weight, a quiet intimacy that felt more damning than anything overt. Patrick scrolled faster now, his heart racing, desperate to find out how far it had gone. And then, there it was. And Emily, you understand me in a way Patrick never could. "Yeah, because I see you, Em. I see the real you. And I wish I could see you more." Or Patrick froze, the words burning into his memory. The casual nature of their earlier exchanges had disappeared entirely, replaced by something deeper, something undeniable. Emily wasn't just confiding in Jack. She was seeking something from him, something Patrick had always thought was theirs alone. His stomach churned as he scrolled further, each message worse than the last. "Yep. Fact. You're incredible, Em. I can't stop thinking about you. Emily. Jack. I don't know what to say. You've been such a good friend to me." "Jack, you don't have to say anything. Just know I'm here for you. Always." The words felt like knives, sharp and unrelenting. Patrick leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Had it ever crossed the line into something physical? Or was this emotional betrayal enough to tear everything apart? He forced himself to keep reading, though every fiber of his being wanted to slam the laptop shut and pretend he hadn't seen anything. The messages revealed a pattern, a slow, deliberate erosion of boundaries. They joked, they shared secrets, and eventually they confided in each other in ways that Patrick couldn't ignore. "Yep, Emily, I've felt so lost lately, like I'm just going through the motions, but talking to you, it's like I can breathe again. Yeah, I'm glad I can be that for you. You deserve so much more than just going through the motions." Yep. Patrick's vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes. He felt a mix of anger and heartbreak, a betrayal so profound that it left him struggling to find air. This wasn't just about the messages. It was about everything they represented. Emily had turned to someone else for comfort, for connection, and in doing so, she had shattered the trust Patrick had built their life upon. He scrolled to the most recent exchange, his hands trembling. "Jack, I can't wait to see you again. Just us this time, no distractions. Emily." Me too. Soon, I promise. That was it. Patrick slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the quiet room. His chest heaved as he sat there, the weight of the messages crushing him. The Emily he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone who had chosen Jack over him in ways that felt irreparable. For a long moment, Patrick didn't move. He simply sat there, the silence of the house mocking him, the words he had read replaying in his mind over and over again. You understand me in a way Patrick never could. The betrayal wasn't just in the messages. It was in the truth they revealed. Emily had already chosen a part of her life that didn't include him, and Patrick didn't know if he could ever forgive her for it. Patrick sat motionless in the dim light of the room, his hands gripping the edges of the desk as if letting go would cause him to fall apart completely. His breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of what he had just read pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Each message felt like a knife. Stab, twist, repeat. Her words echoed in his mind, overlapping and relentless. You understand me in a way Patrick never could. The sentence played on a loop, growing louder and sharper with every repetition. He shut his eyes tightly, as if he could block out the pain. It didn't help. Why Jack? Why her? Why now? His thoughts raced, spiraling faster and faster, each one colliding with the next. His stomach churned and he doubled over, feeling physically ill. This was supposed to be the woman he could trust above all others, the one who promised to be by his side through everything. Now, she was the one tearing him apart. Patrick ran a hand through his hair, gripping it tightly as if the pain might ground him. But it didn't. It only amplified the storm raging inside. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't breathe. Every emotion hit him all at once. Anger, sadness, betrayal, confusion. His mind flashed back to the life they'd built together. Sunday mornings over coffee, late-night talks about dreams and plans, quiet moments on the couch, her laughter filling the room. Were all those moments a lie? Had she been slipping away from him all this time, and he had been too blind to see it? His fist came down hard on the desk, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. It didn't ease the pain. Nothing did. His eyes burned as tears finally spilled over, hot and relentless. Patrick didn't try to stop them. He let the grief consume him. How could she? He muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, because no answer would ever be good enough. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his mind grasping for clarity but finding none. Every step felt heavier than the last. His thoughts were loud, chaotic. She chose him. She chose Jack, not me. He couldn't stop repeating it, couldn't shake the truth of it. It was as if the foundation of his entire world had crumbled beneath him, leaving him with nothing but the jagged pieces. Patrick didn't wait until morning. He couldn't. The betrayal was too fresh, the anger too raw. With the laptop still on the desk behind him, he stormed down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. His hand hesitated on the doorknob to the guest room, but only for a second. He pushed it open, the door creaking loudly in the silence. Emily stirred, blinking groggily. "Patrick?" Her voice was soft, confused. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" he repeated, his voice tight, trembling with barely contained fury. He stepped closer, holding his phone in one hand. "You tell me, Emily." "Mammy." Her confusion turned to alarm as she saw his expression. "Patrick, what?" He cut her off, his voice rising. "Don't. Just don't. I saw the messages. All of them." Emily froze, her eyes wide. For a moment she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Patrick laughed bitterly. "Not what I think. You told him I didn't understand you, that he makes your days brighter, and you promised to see him again. Tell me, Emily, what exactly am I supposed to think?" Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head desperately. "It was never physical, Patrick. I swear. I was lonely, and Jack was there." Patrick's eyes burned as he stared at her. Lonely, he repeated, his voice breaking. You betrayed me, Emily. That's all I need to know. Her sobs broke the silence as Patrick turned and walked out of the room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He simply left, leaving Emily with her guilt and himself with a heartbreak he wasn't sure he could ever recover from. Patrick parked his car in front of Tyler's modest house, the engine ticking as it cooled. The warmth of the porch light felt like a small comfort as he stepped out, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the past few days. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't need to. Tyler had always been the one person Patrick could count on, no matter the hour. The door opened before Patrick even knocked. Tyler stood there, wearing an old hoodie and a concerned expression. You look like hell, he said bluntly, stepping aside to let Patrick in. Patrick let out a weak chuckle as he walked into the familiar living room. That obvious, huh? Yeah. Tyler motioned to the couch, grabbing 2 beers from the fridge before sitting across from him. You want to talk about it, or should I start guessing? For a moment, Patrick didn't answer. He stared at the bottle in his hands, twisting it aimlessly. Finally, he looked up, his voice raw. Emily. She's been talking to someone else. Jack. Ending. Tyler didn't flinch. He just nodded, letting the words settle before speaking. How bad? Bad, Patrick admitted, his voice breaking. Messages. Emotional stuff. She said she was lonely, like it's my fault. Tyler sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, man, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You're broken right now, but you don't have to stay that way. But look at you. Think of you. What kind of life do you want to create? Patrick glanced at him, his chest tightening. How? How do I fix this? Tyler shook his head. I don't have that answer, Patrick, but I know one thing. You can't fix her. You can only fix yourself. Start there. The words hit harder than Patrick expected. He wasn't sure if they gave him hope or just more questions, but for the first time in days he felt a flicker of clarity. The bar was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed Patrick's life. He sat at the counter, nursing a whiskey he wasn't sure he even wanted. The dim lighting and soft hum of music offered a small reprieve, a place where he could fade into the background. Long day? A voice asked, pulling him from his thoughts. Patrick turned to see a woman sitting a few stools down. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, the kind of presence that made her seem approachable, even in a room full of strangers. Patrick sat next to William. You could say that, Patrick replied, managing a faint smile. She slid one stool closer, her movements easy, unassuming. Well, here's to surviving it, she said, raising her glass slightly. Patrick hesitated before clinking his glass against hers. Cheers, he murmured, taking a sip. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the kind that didn't demand explanations, but eventually she spoke again. I'm Rachel, by the way. Patrick, he replied, setting his glass down. He didn't know why, but the simple act of introducing himself felt significant, as if it were a step toward reclaiming a part of himself. Rachel tilted her head, studying him. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. Want to talk about it? Or should I start guessing? Patrick chuckled softly. It was the second time someone had asked him that in the past 24 hours, but somehow it felt different coming from her. It's complicated, he said finally. As usually is, Rachel replied, her tone light but empathetic. But sometimes, saying it out loud makes it feel a little less heavy. Patrick hesitated, but something about her, her kindness, her lack of judgment, made him feel safe. My wife, he began, his voice quiet. She's been seeing someone. Not physically, but emotionally. And it feels worse somehow, like she gave a part of herself away that I can't get back. Rachel nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. That's a deep wound, she said. But you're here. That means something, doesn't it? Patrick looked at her, surprised by the simplicity of her observation. What do you mean? She smiled faintly. It means you're still trying to figure it out. You haven't given up on yourself. Her words settled over him like a soft blanket, offering a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. They talked for hours after that, about everything and nothing. She told him about her love for hiking, her failed attempts at baking, and her own experiences with heartbreak. Sometimes, Rachel said as their conversation slowed, we lose ourselves in others. But we can find ourselves again. It's not easy, but it's possible. We begin the process of separation exercise. Patrick let her words sink in, feeling the smallest glimmer of hope for the first time in what felt like forever. As the night wore on, he realized he didn't feel as heavy as he had when he walked in. Rachel wasn't a solution to his problems, but she was a reminder that healing was possible, and for now, that was enough. The sterile scent of the counselor's office greeted Patrick as he stepped inside, his stomach twisting with unease. Emily followed a few steps behind, her expression guarded. They hadn't spoken much since that night, their conversations reduced to practicalities and half-hearted attempts at civility. Now, as they sat on opposite ends of the small couch, the distance between them felt as vast as an ocean. The counselor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, introduced herself as Dr. Reese. I know this isn't easy, she began, her voice steady, but it's a good first step. Why don't we start with what brought you both here? Patrick glanced at Emily, waiting for her to speak. She didn't. Instead, she stared at her hands, her fingers twisting the silver ring she always wore. When the silence grew too heavy, Patrick cleared his throat. She's been talking to someone, he said, his voice tight. Another man, Jack. Emily flinched slightly but said nothing. Dr. Reese nodded, her gaze shifting to Emily. Emily, would you like to respond to that? Emily hesitated, then let out a small sigh. It wasn't what he thinks, she said softly. It was never physical. Patrick scoffed, shaking his head. That doesn't make it any better. Emily's eyes flicked to him, a spark of anger breaking through her otherwise subdued demeanor. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Patrick. I was lonely. I felt invisible. Her words hit like a slap. Patrick leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he tried to keep his voice steady. Invisible? Emily, I gave you everything, and still, it wasn't enough? Sure. Emily's voice trembled as she replied. You gave me stability, Patrick, but you didn't give me you. Not really. You were always so distant, so wrapped up in your own world. Jack made me feel seen. Patrick clenched his jaw, the bitterness rising in his chest. So that justifies it? Going to him instead of coming to me? It's not about justification, Emily shot back, her voice rising. It's about what I needed. And you didn't even notice that I needed it. Dr. Reese raised a hand gently, her voice breaking through the tension. Let's pause for a moment. These feelings you're both expressing, hurt, neglect, anger, are valid, but it's important to understand where they're coming from. Emily, can you explain more about why you felt invisible? Emily hesitated, glancing at Patrick before speaking. It's hard to explain. It wasn't just one thing. It was the way he would shut me out when he was stressed, the way he'd brush off my feelings because he thought I was overreacting. After a while, it felt like I was living with a stranger. Patrick's chest tightened, guilt mixing with his anger. He looked at Dr. Reese, searching for some kind of answer. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize she felt that way. Dr. Reese nodded. It's not uncommon for these kinds of feelings to go unnoticed until they reach a breaking point. Patrick, what about you? How do you feel about what Emily just shared? Patrick sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I feel blindsided, hurt. I thought we were okay. I thought I was doing enough, but clearly I wasn't. Emily's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Dr. Reese leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. Patrick, what about your own emotions? How have you been managing the anger this situation has brought up? He hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. Not well, he admitted. I've been angry at her, at Jack, at myself, and sometimes I don't know how to control it. It's like it just takes over. Dr. Reese nodded again, her expression empathetic. Anger is a natural response to betrayal, but it's also something that can harm relationships if it isn't managed. Have you experienced this kind of anger before? Patrick frowned, thinking back. I guess I've always had a temper, he admitted, but I never thought it was a problem until now. Emily glanced at him, her voice softer this time. Your anger is part of why I couldn't talk to you, Patrick. I was scared it would just turn into another fight. Patrick's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. I never wanted to make you feel that way, he said quietly. I didn't know how to show you I cared. I thought working hard, providing for us was enough. Dr. Reese leaned back, letting the silence settle for a moment before speaking again. It sounds like there's a lot of unspoken pain and unmet needs between you two. If we're going to move forward, it's important to address both. Emily, can you see a way to rebuild trust with Patrick? And Patrick, are you willing to work on understanding and managing your emotions? They both nodded, though the path ahead still felt uncertain. For the first time in weeks, though, Patrick felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Patrick sat alone in the park, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the ground. In his hands, he turned his wedding ring over and over, the small band catching the last rays of light. His mind was a storm, thoughts crashing into each other with no clear resolution. He had never imagined he would find himself here, caught between two worlds, two possibilities, and no easy way forward. Emily's face hovered in his thoughts, a reflection of everything they had shared. Years of laughter, struggles, and quiet moments. The way she looked at him during their wedding, her eyes filled with a love he had believed was unshakable. But now, those memories felt tainted, their edges sharpened by her betrayal. She had been his partner, his home. And yet, she had turned to someone else when things got hard. Emily's face was a mirror of my past, he thought, staring at the ring in his palm. It was a past that had shaped him, a foundation he wasn't sure he could abandon, even with the cracks that had formed. But then there was Rachel. Her voice was softer in his mind, her presence newer, unburdened by the weight of shared history. Rachel had shown him a kindness that felt like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. She didn't know the man he had been, didn't carry the baggage of their broken marriage. When he thought of her, he felt something he hadn't in years, possibility. Rachel's smile, a glimpse of my future, he mused, the thought both thrilling and terrifying. Yeah, the choice wasn't simple. Rebuilding trust with Emily would mean confronting their pain head-on, diving into the depths of their issues with no guarantee of success. It would mean forgiving her and asking for her forgiveness in return. Patrick wasn't sure he could do that. The wound was still raw, and every time he closed his eyes, the messages she had sent to Jack replayed in his mind like a cruel reminder of what they had lost. And yet, he couldn't ignore the moments they had shared in counseling. The way Emily had looked at him when she admitted to feeling invisible, her voice trembling with regret. There had been truth in her words, a vulnerability that made him question whether he had failed her as much as she had failed him. She wanted to fight for them, she had said. She wanted to make things right. But could he trust her again? Would the shadow of Jack always loom over their relationship, a constant reminder of what had happened? Patrick's heart ached at the thought of trying and failing, of opening himself up to more pain. Then there was Rachel. She represented everything Emily wasn't. New, uncomplicated, a blank slate. In the short time they had spent together, Rachel had made him feel understood in a way that surprised him. She didn't push, didn't expect anything from him except honesty. Her words echoed in his mind. Sometimes we lose ourselves in others, but we can find ourselves again. Rachel had reminded him of who he was outside of his marriage, a man capable of rebuilding, of starting fresh. But choosing her would mean leaving behind the life he had built with Emily, walking away from the vows he had once believed in so deeply. Could he live with that? Could he walk away from the woman who had been his everything for so long? Yeah. The sun dipped below the horizon, the park growing colder and quieter. Patrick clenched the ring in his fist, his thoughts still tangled. He knew there was no perfect choice. Both paths came with their own risks, their own rewards. Staying with Emily meant holding on to the familiar, but it also meant stepping into uncharted territory as they tried to repair what had been broken. Choosing Rachel meant letting go of the past entirely, taking a leap into the unknown. As he sat there, Patrick realized the decision wasn't just about Emily or Rachel. It was about him, who he wanted to be, what he was willing to fight for or let go of. The answer wouldn't come easily, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The first stars began to appear in the sky as Patrick stood, slipping the ring into his pocket. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing. The choice wasn't about where he had been, it was about where he wanted to go. The decision hadn't come easily. Patrick had spent days in a fog, weighing the possibility of rebuilding with Emily against the pain of her betrayal. In the end, he chose to stay. Counseling had helped them start conversations they should have had long ago. Emily's tears, her pleas, her repeated promise to make things right. It all felt genuine. Patrick wanted to believe her, to believe in the marriage they had fought to build. He moved back into their shared bedroom, and for a while things seemed different. Emily was attentive in a way she hadn't been in years. They shared quiet dinners, talked late into the night, and even revisited old routines that had once defined their relationship. Patrick allowed himself to hope, cautiously, that they might find a way forward. But trust is a fragile thing. It takes time to rebuild, and Patrick's doubts lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. Emily's phone still buzzed frequently, though she assured him it was just work. She kept it close, never leaving it unattended for long. Patrick tried to ignore the nagging voice in his head, the one that whispered, "What if?" One afternoon, Patrick stopped by a cafe near his office, intending to surprise Emily with her favorite latte. She had mentioned she'd be working late nearby, and he thought a small gesture might brighten her day. The cafe was busy, the low hum of conversation filling the air as Patrick scanned the room. And then he saw her. There she was, laughing with Jack. Patrick froze, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Emily's head was tilted back, her laughter filling the space between them. Jack leaned in, his hand brushing hers as they sat across from each other. It was too intimate, too familiar. Patrick's stomach churned, the weight of realization crashing over him. The betrayal wasn't over. It never had been. Time seemed to slow as Patrick watched them, his mind racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an innocent meeting. Emily had lied. Again. Everything they'd worked toward, the nights spent in counseling, the promises she had made, they meant nothing. She was still choosing Jack, even as she pretended to rebuild what they had. Patrick stepped back, the cup of coffee in his hand trembling. He couldn't bring himself to confront her. Not here, not now. Instead, he turned and walked out, the sound of her laughter still ringing in his ears. It wasn't the joyful melody he remembered. It was hollow, mocking, a reminder of what he had lost. The drive home was a blur, the streets blending into a haze of headlights and shadows. Patrick's thoughts swirled, anger and sadness warring for dominance. He felt foolish, humiliated, but above all, he felt free. The truth was undeniable now. Emily wasn't willing to let go of Jack, and Patrick wasn't willing to live in a marriage built on lies. By the time he reached home, his decision was clear. He packed a bag with only the essentials, leaving his wedding ring on the nightstand. The house was quiet, suffocating in its stillness. Patrick didn't linger. He didn't need to. As he drove away, the weight on his chest began to lift. The pain of Emily's betrayal was still sharp, but it no longer consumed him. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. Sometimes, love isn't enough, Patrick reflected as he stared at the road ahead. Betrayal changes everything, but through pain we find clarity and strength. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were his. He leaned on Tyler, on the small circle of friends who reminded him of his worth. He even reached out to Rachel, not as a romantic prospect, but as someone who had shown him that healing was possible. Patrick knew he had a long road ahead, but he was ready to walk it. The life he had with Emily was over, but his own life wasn't. He had the chance to rebuild, not a broken marriage, but himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Patrick was moving forward, step by step, toward a future that was his to shape. He didn't know what it held, but he was ready to find out.